scientists or researchers? Oh, great. Okay. How many people have had a lot of media experience? All right, that's it. So I'm not going to reach my nose on the camera around so that I don't miss things. I run Science Communication Network. It's a nonprofit organization which is supported by foundations 100%. I'm really lucky about that because that means we get to have our science advisors help us determine what research to work on, what's really going to move the field forward instead of being hired. Our goal is improved news reporting of strategically important environmental health science. We help researchers be more comfortable and effective in their communications with journalists. We identify and strategically prioritize and then publicize important environmental health research. We do it providing reporters context. We do it without alarmism and without advocacy, advocating only for the science, which is different than what a lot of groups do. So I've been asked to talk about translating science. I did assume a lot of you are scientists. So it's like a mini media training 101. Sorry for anyone who's not a scientist or who's had tons of experience if this is too basic. I'm going to talk about the special role of scientists in media, how reporters decide something's news and how they decide whether they're going to cover what they're not. How do you convey science clearly and in context so it's well reported? How to talk to reporters about your research given the uncertainty inherent in good science. Talk about how you look on camera a little bit, how you look on computer interviews, how you sound on radio, and some tips for controlling the interviews so you end up with interviews that you're happy with. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video clip. It is really dated. I apologize for that, but I've never found one that's better for making this point. This is in no way meant to be political, but watch what, let's see, I'm going to try to figure out how to use this. Watch what this says to you about how people perceive science. And does someone know how to make this run in slideshow so this will be available? So yeah, it's 2014, but it's still great. Thank you.
The biggest threat is climate change to the Texas coastline. The Texas coastline is impacted by rising sea levels. And again, the question is whether or not that's man-made, and I'll leave that to the scientists.
But you don't doubt that human activity contributes to climate change.
Well, we'll see in terms of the science, in terms of there's a wide range that has been discussed. And again, I'm not a scientist by any stretch, but everywhere from no impact at all to 100%.
Yeah, he's no scientist. He's no scientist. In fact, I'm impressed he was able to narrow it down from 0 to 100%. Am I? Somewhere between 0 and 100%. And folks, George P.'s not alone.
I'm not a scientist, nor am I a physicist.
I'm not qualified to debate the science over climate change.
I'm not a scientist.
I'm not a scientist. What I have said repeatedly is I'm not a scientist.
Yes, everyone who denies man-made climate change has the same enduring message. We don't know what we're talking about. I hope that these conservative leaders can inspire all the children out there watching to think to themselves, hey, maybe someday I could grow up to be not a scientist.
So, people can say anything, but scientists tell the truth. Okay? That's the thing. People are confused about environmental health science. They see conflicting news reports, right? BPA is harmful, BPA is safe, flame retardants are toxic. We need them to stop fires. Oh wait, they don't work. People are confused. They're wary of being spun, but as we saw in the Colbert clip, they do trust the science. People think of scientists, they think of you as somewhat pure, you have no stake in your findings, no political, no financial stake. You're telling the truth. Your agenda is just the science, and that's really powerful, and it's worth protecting. You protect your credibility as a scientist by being objective. I'm not sure where to stand. I'm not blocking you all. Should I just? You're fine. Okay, so I want to talk from the slides. When you're speaking publicly about your research, you want to stick with the science rather than offering opinions on policy or things where you're not the expert. You may feel strongly about things related to your science, and that's just fine. But when you're interviewing about a study you're publicizing, a study your work, that's where you're the expert. You don't want to talk about things where you're not necessarily the expert, because that can lessen your credibility in the science. And your science can support an advocacy agenda, but I should tell people, don't get on the board of an advocacy group, especially early in your career, where reporters are likely to assume that you share the advocacy group's agenda rather than being straight science. But it's another training. There's lots of ways you can support advocacy groups behind the scenes. And I'm happy to help anybody who wants to talk. So, too many things. Almost all research is valuable and moves us forward, but it's not all newsworthy. So let's talk about that. What is news? How do reporters decide what they're going to write about and what they're going to pass on? News is a product. It's like toothpaste, right? If you watch TV news, the show is 30 minutes, no matter what happened that day. You could have 9/11, or it could be Thanksgiving Day, and you're going to see all these stories on turkeys and turkey hotlines. So for reporters, the criteria for news is really simple. How does this affect the lives of my audience? Does this affect the lives? Torrential rains out over the ocean, it's a news story. For some people, climate, weather. Flooding in North Carolina is a huge news story that goes on for days because people are affected. Is it new? If it isn't new, it's not news. And for science, what that means is once it's published online, usually, it's generally not going to be considered news, it's going to be considered background, which is really important, and there are definitely exceptions. Is it unusual? The classic definition of news is easy. Look at the picture, right? Man bites dog is unusual. A dog biting man, which just happens, and dogs just kill someone easy. Dogs killing someone is unusual. Dog biting someone, no. Is it interesting or significant? So, say you've got a school board meeting. It's new, it doesn't happen every day. It's important to a small group of people, but it's not going to rise to the level of news unless something really, like the superintendent bites a dog and you've got a news story. Okay. Let me tell you a little about who reporters are. Is anyone in the room been a reporter? Thank you, good. So I say this with a lot of affection and a lot of generalities, but news reporters are generally overworked. They're well-educated, highly skilled professionals. They're very good at gathering and presenting information. They're not usually experts in their field, even if they're science reporters. The average reporter, you can assume, has a 10th grade science education. Maybe took a biology class in 10th grade. Science writers, you can assume a college level course. Wouldn't assume more. Once you talk to them, you may find some who have way more experience. But if you're going to make an assumption and you're going to get on the phone cold for an interview, that's not a bad idea to start with. Lower. They're typically smart, they're under pressure, they're covering several beats typically, and they're on deadline. Deadlines are not flexible. They want to tell a good story. They care a lot about being interesting to their audiences. It really matters. Controversy and balance are important. They make a good story, and reporters sometimes talk about false balance, where they try and show two sides even when they know one side is better science than the other. Think of climate change. It's something reporters talk about a lot, trying to figure out what to do. They care a lot about getting it right for their own sense of professionalism, for their editors. They don't take it lightly if you give them wrong information or give them half information or a story you wish was the case but isn't really. A reporter might be your friend outside of work, but when they're working on a story, you're another source. Anything you say can be used. Reporters have word limits, and they have editors whose job it is to sell papers. And sometimes the editors write the headlines. So take a look at this. You want to read it from that?
I'm going to expand a little bit on the balance issue, because I think we understand with climate change that this has been a real problem in terms of public perception, public understanding of climate change, where until very recently, there's been this false promulgation of balance. If you want to expand on that.
Good question. I don't work on climate science that often. I do some climate and health stuff. I think from our perspective, just to be aware that reporters are going to talk to someone critical of the science. Whatever they have, whatever you give them, whatever report they're writing about or a study, they're going to look for another point of view. You can inoculate them to the really bad ones and say, you might hear this, and when you do, keep in mind that it's not a really valid point of view because of this, or the science on that is really shaky. I think that's the best you can do. But knowing that they're going to have to find another side, or try to, if you tell them up front that there really isn't one, and you can tell them that. Would you, Kathy, would you go to the how would you? I know reporters wrestle with this all the time, especially if they know this.
Yeah, I mean, giving, like Amy said, sort of preview of what they might hear, and then rebutting it right up front can help. But, and I think you can also talk about the preponderance of evidence and point them in that direction, because a lot of them, if they don't have a science background, don't really understand that. But if you've got all these different studies showing the same thing, yes, it's not 100% sure, but it's really a very solid thing.
And for environmental health science, that can often be, saying, well, the animal literature supports this, and making sure you have some of those studies available to hand to them. I also think if you look in newspapers, if that argument is way down at the bottom, the false balance is down at the bottom, most people read the headline in the first paragraph. Most people don't read beyond that unless it's about them. So you kind of take it for what it is. You can't really control what a reporter writes.
It is a striking problem relative to climate change, like Jerry was saying, because when they've taken polls of people's perceptions, most people are pretty okay that climate's changing, and humans are doing it, 60-70% or so. And they're also welcoming to action on it, like renewables and things. But then when you ask people if scientists are still torn on this, if we're still open, it's most people believe that it's 50-50. And it's because of that darn split screen, you have to have that pro and con. And when 98% of the scientists out there are in agreement, there really is not much of another side.
You can't tell reporters what to write. You can keep putting that out there. I mean, if I were working on that, I would be getting all the major associations to constantly say 98% of scientists are in agreement, which I think a lot of them do, and have that up front, so you can have the same message that if everyone gives the same message and uses the same language, it eventually does get through. And reporters generally know when it's not true. Climate has been a nightmare from a media perspective, I think. Anyone have a different opinion? Because,
I think these days probably the avenue I would take is just not to speak to reporters who I don't know are good on climate. So I mean, these days major outlets often have policies that they no longer give credence to climate science.
to climate deniers, yeah. Which is huge progress, and that is exactly thanks to these organizations and the scientists who continually said it. So repetition works, we're just saying it over and over, which it worked with the other side too, right?
Yeah.
Deniers, but enough real scientists.
Just another point about where the public is currently. I think we've been able to see an evolution such that, yes, as Peter said, more of the public recognizes that climate change is real. Few of them believe that it's going to directly affect them.
Do you feel like that's changing? I don't do a whole lot on climate anymore. We used to do climate and health, but it feels like that might be changing.
Year by year it moves in that direction, but the perception now is that it's going to cost us billions and billions of dollars to fix. And there's a little truth to that, but we're still gonna, well, yeah, I don't wanna get into it, but.
It's more if we don't, right?
It's her talk.
This is headlines. You cannot really control the headline either. There are ways you can help reporters write about your research. You can be a good source. I've kind of designed this talk around for researchers who are publicizing papers and they're not, they're going to publish in about a week. You've got a bit of time. For reporters, so you sent it out under an embargo, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But when reporters call you, call back promptly. Don't be sailing off the coast of France where there's no cell reception. Don't make stuff up. People do because they want to help a reporter. It's human nature. Be honest about what you don't know. Saying I don't know is fine. It's not my area of expertise. Scientists' job is to translate the science into clear, concise statements to make it easier for reporters to know what you want them to know. It's pretty simple.
Question, is that our work?
Yes.
To translate our science to reporters?
Yes. So they can get it, and then they can tell a story about it. They can get it to their audience accurately.
We're not trained on that.
I'll train you. Happy to. And we'll talk a little about that in a minute. The reason I started Science Communication Network so many years ago was that environmental health scientists almost entirely said, we don't want to talk to reporters anymore. They get it wrong, they don't understand endocrine disruptors. Why? And people like Herb Needleman and Theo Colborn and Shauna Swan, I think a lot of you know these folks. So we started as a scientist support network, and it evolved into Science Communication Network. So our real goal here is to give scientists the tools to control how their science is reported. Okay, so that's where all this comes from. And while I would tell you all not to use any jargon when you talk to reporters until you know them and know that they know what it means, I'm going to just give you a few reporter jargon words because you will hear them. Embargo. Do people know this? Is this too? I don't want to please tell me stuff you already know.
So we have a range because we also have a lot of students who probably
great.
also don't know this language.
So, thank you. An embargo is when you work with a journal to set a specific date and time at which your paper will publish, and it's usually online publication. The journal allows you to give the paper to reporters in advance of that date, and reporters agree to the embargo, meaning they won't write or produce anything about the paper until the embargo lifts. And that's how you see stories like today in Nature, and the article's already written, and it's well written, and you get more thoughtful, in-depth articles that way. Press release highlights the key points of the study, has quotes approved for use as is, approved by the institution and the author. Reporters can just take pieces of it or use the whole thing without permission. An exclusive is when you give a news story to one reporter, and Kathy may disagree with me on this, but I don't ever recommend exclusives unless you have a story that no one's going to write about, that no one's interested in, because it irritates the people who didn't get it. Infographics are fantastic. They show, they don't tell. They're a visual display of data with very few words, and they can go viral in a way that a print article or even a video can't. A lot of journals are now requesting infographics to some extent along with studies, and they're just fantastic. This is one of my favorite slides. Scientists who are publishing research and journalists live in the same world, kind of, pretty much. And I want to thank Nancy Barron, who's a communications trainer for the Leopold Leadership Program. This is from her book, but heavily adapted for our purposes. And apologies for generalizations, but I think it's a good point. Scientists take their time, sometimes a lot of time, to be as specific as possible, while journalists work fast, using the best information available at the time. Scientists talk specifically about what they know, and journalists ask questions and try to get the general idea. Science is peer-reviewed before it's published, and journalists have deadlines, and they can continue to tell stories in future articles, and they can correct the record. Scientists talk about what they found, and journalists need to know why that matters to their audience. Science doesn't prove, it disproves, but the news media reports facts. They report what is certain, but they can correct the record. Scientists live in a nuanced world with caveats and details. Reporters have word limits, and they have editors who need to sell papers. So here are some examples of how these cultural differences play out. This is titled here's what reporters did with it. Yeah.
So you talk about reporters need to sell papers. And I want to emphasize that word paper. Because so much of the news world now is in fact not a physical print world, but an online world. And how does that, or does that in any way, change what we need to be doing? Given that it really is no longer a once a day or twice a day kind of phenomenon, but a constantly rolling phenomenon.
I don't think it changes the science, and online outlets, as they need advertisers. They need to sell to their advertisers. So for them, it's about how many people read it. It's really the same equation. From the scientist's perspective, I think it's the same.
One thing I would add is just the embargo. You need to pitch the paper before it goes online. In other words, you embargo it like a few days ahead of time, give them time so that the paper doesn't come out online and then you're pitching it, because then they say, oh, it's old news. So it makes up for a little bit of tension, because you've got to have everything done ahead of time until the, you know, to get it to the point where you are pitching it and it's out online. So it's just pushed everything up, like the whole news cycle is pushed up.
And online sites are not allowed to run anything before the embargo is either.
Right.
So those journalists are exactly the same. The difference might be bloggers and
Right.
a lot of social media influencers. I always tell people, if you don't know who it is and you don't trust them to respect the embargo, just don't talk to them until your paper is published, because journals do have the right to rescind their offer of publication if news comes out about your study before the embargo lifts. And the way you get an embargo is you negotiate with the journal. You tell them, I'd like to do advance publicity. May I have a publication date and an embargo period? Some say yes, most say yes, because it helps them get attention. A few say a few don't have the capability. They can only publish the minute it's in. I would generally say don't return the proofs until you've asked that question.
Can we go back to your figure with the cultural differences?
Sure.
Because
Never asked for that.
for most of us, we live in that science world, and the journalist lives in a totally different world. And over my career, many times, I've been called by reporters, and I don't want to talk to them, because we live in this gray world where nothing is in black and white, and the reporter wants a headline that says antibiotic resistance doesn't exist or whatever. And for most of us, there's a barrier that says, I don't want to talk to those guys. And so the question for you is, we clearly in the environmental area, we need to talk to the public. The question is, how do we do it without getting a false message?
You are ahead of me by about 6 slides. It's going to talk about how do you communicate uncertainty in science and still give the reporter something to report. I would never in a million years want a scientist to say anything that made them uncomfortable, which is why we do the training. In advance, we think about what do we want to say, and we also run mock interviews before anyone publishes a paper. We sit down with them and ask the toughest questions we can think of and help them find the answers they're comfortable with before they start talking to reporters. Practice is good, and it's not rocket science to figure out what reporters are going to ask you and what they're going to want from you, and how to. I have some tips on how to not get pushed around. Some important tactics to get you to say more than you want to. You don't have to do that. You don't have to.
About the embargo, how strong is the code of ethics around it? It's
Yeah.
very strong. You can
Yeah.
really trust them.
Okay, it will. If you don't trust the reporter, you don't give them the study until the embargo lifts. the people I work with, the reporters, Kathy knows, I know, we know who to trust and who not to. The only person who ever, he didn't break an embargo, but he was asked not to use the scientist's name, and he did, by mistake, his name Kostant. You know, so even the best, he was hiking and he took it down immediately. He said, "Oh, I'm so sorry." People don't, reporters don't want to break them because then they know they'll never get an advance notice again, and word spreads. So I can't think of any credible journalists like you.
We had this happen with the Puerto Rico study, that's when Carlos was bringing it
Oh,
up.
sorry.
And it was, the government released the study to this reporter, so and then once it was up online, we had to open it up to all the other journalists because it was already out there, so, but it is very unusual. I've never had it happen except for this.
Was that the government of Puerto Rico?
The government.
So the government broke the embargo, basically.
Yeah, because they wanted to get out ahead of the story and comment, which.
That's not fair and not nice, and can't do anything about it.
Right.
I've never had it happen except by absolute accident.
The relationship is with the journalist,
Yes.
not with the journalist.
It's with the journal.
It's with the journal.
The journal gives me permission to give out the paper in advance, and then if, say, I'm working with Kathy, they'll give her permission as well, but we don't do anything without that in writing. And everybody agrees, knows the time, there's no fuzziness on that.
And this was a report we published on our website first, and then months later it was in the Lancet. So we didn't have a journal behind us saying.
No, but I'm talking about, is it with CNN, or is it with the Washington Post, or is it with Sherifink, the New York Times? With whom are we dealing on an embargo? With
The
the
journal.
reporter or with the New York
Okay,
Times?
so you're saying if the report doesn't have a journal behind it, it's a report. You would set the embargo, and every reporter would have to review it before I
It's
give
the
them the report.
reporter.
It's the reporter. Yeah, I think the journals, if the reporter breaks the embargo, some of the journals will not give them advance copies anymore, so they are under some onus to cooperate.
And if they do break the embargo, it's usually a huge mistake, and they take it down right away. But, yeah. The other thing you do is if somebody does break it, we would have to go tell every reporter who has the paper, the embargo's up, go.
Yeah, that's what happened.
And it's really not fun.
What happened here?
I'm sorry, that's a terrible experience. This is another title, and here's what reporters did with it. Okay, so you can see, trying to think about how reporters and scientists think differently. So how do you translate your science for journalists? How do you tell them your story so they report it accurately? Use this inverted pyramid. How many people recognize this as a writing style? All right. So I work with scientists, right, who write beautifully as scientists. And I generally ask them to try and think like a reporter, which is the exact opposite in writing. Science is, background, methods, results, then conclusion. A reporter's going to try and tell the whole story in the headline and the first paragraph, because people aren't just going to read further. Or if it's an audio story, they still want to get it right up front because that's where they're getting their attention. If you flip scientific writing absolutely upside down, you have something much more like a news article. What was found, why it matters, and then all the rest. It's really simple. Ami's looking at it. I've heard this so many times. Reporters will begin with the conclusion, because that's the part that people want to walk away with. The headline is the most dramatic, newsworthy piece, and supporting facts follow. Take a look at some news articles and see if this works, because it's what reporters, it's how they're approaching your science. They look at the study and think, this is what I'm going to need to do. Shrimp on a treadmill ring a bell with anybody? The phrase? Are you laughing because it does? Do you know it? Oh, okay, great. I'll tell you a short story. Because you know a little about reporters, you know how they think differently from scientists. An interview is friendly and it can be conversational, but it's not a chat. In all cases, you want to go into an interview, and I almost never say all, with a clear idea of what you want the reporter to know. And you want to be prepared to say it clearly and concisely in several different ways during an interview, because people remember things best when they hear them 6, 7 different times in slightly different ways. Okay, shrimp on a treadmill. a really good climate researcher had as a byproduct of his work a video clip of a shrimp running on a treadmill. It was really cute. His grad student put it on YouTube, it went viral. Today's Show called and said, would you come on the show and talk to us tonight? You bring the shrimp? We're like, yeah.
Shrimps will start now.
So they show up in the studio. Today asked really good questions. They started out by saying, well, why did you do this? Why did you have a shrimp doing this? What did you find? But the scientist was being a normal human being, and the answers weren't quick. They weren't clear. They weren't concise. He wasn't prepared with what he wanted to come out, what were his messages. And it became a very cute chat. It was, he tried this with lobsters. Did they ever sprain their ankles? Do shrimp have ankles? And it went on. So yeah, Shrimp on a Treadmill got a lot of attention and created an opportunity to tell the world about this really important work. But to make sure you never waste such a great media opportunity, we're going to talk about messages. You've heard people say stay on message, and that just makes me cringe because I think it's like a political or an advocacy campaign. Your messages are what you found and why it's important. Your messages are your science. So you're not trying to spin anyone or persuade anyone. Straight on the science. It's what you want the press and through them the public to know. So if you know what you want to say before you talk to a reporter, you're going to have a lot more control during the interview. And I have made the mistake of going into an interview with no messages, and it feels awful. So my hope is that you all never will do that. First, think simply. You need 2 or 3 main messages for any interview. More than that, and you will confuse the reporter. They won't know what am I supposed to be listening for? Remember that inverted pyramid. Those are the things you want to see in a headline in the first paragraph of every article or every news story about your research. Clear language, short sentences, no jargon. Practice on friends and family who don't know what you do. And just make sure they get the main idea. I'm not saying dumb it down at all. I'm talking about boil it down, make it clear with plain language. Messages should be simple enough and plain enough language you can repeat them easily in slightly different ways throughout the interview. Repeating them is the way you tell the reporter, this is what matters. It's how they walk away with that sort of written several times. Think about your audience. You're going to have the same messages no matter what, because here's what I found, and here's why it's important. But you might change the way you say it for different audiences. Is it a rural community fighting for its life? Is it teenagers who are told you have to pay attention, read this article for homework assignment? Is it a room full of researchers who really know what you're talking about? A lot of people organize their thoughts by thinking about those 2 or 3 main messages and putting them on a file card and keeping it with them at all times. And then repeat the messages throughout as a way to flag for reporters. This is what I want you to know. And that way you shape your story. This is, years ago I worked with a coalition on persistent organic pollutants. This is the message they gave me when I walked in the door. And it's absolutely correct. And most of you in this room would know what this means. But a lot of reporters wouldn't. So what we did was boiled it down for the media, and again, not dumbed down at all, but boiled down. So the reporter can come in and say, tell me about the treaty, tell me about the chemicals, tell me about the health problems. And it's not intimidating, but it's like, big, here's what I've got, do you want it? Both messages are accurate, but until you boil it down, what?
That is boring.
Yes.
Curious about that. Everybody knows that. That's interesting.
If I'm a reporter, it's just like, I don't know Pop-Star, I don't know YNC4, I know UNEP, but I don't know what state is. And if you're a reporter, you don't know that. And it's just like, I'm going to go over to the refreshment stand. But you're right, from a science perspective, this is much more interesting. But this gives you a chance to tell the reporter about all of that. They don't walk away. Really. So here's more examples. What do you like better? This, and I know what you're saying. This, or this. Basically, that's really what a reporter needs to know in order to engage, to start asking you more details, to give you the chance to say that. And now we're going to, your own messages. So when I ask people when they have a study and they want us to work on it, the first thing I say is, tell me what you found and tell me why it's important. That's pretty much gonna be what we're gonna tell reporters. We don't do press releases, we do a short little note to reporters that they can't write an article from, it's not enough information, but it offers the paper in advance, under embargo, and it gives them enough to know if they wanna read the paper. My goal was that they always read the paper and talk with the authors, instead of just writing. But then we also are thrilled when we have a press release that we can give, so that for those who really don't have time or can't write, that do their own research, they have that. All right, so here we go, communicating uncertainty in science. And this is, we did a study several years ago and figured out that this is where environmental health science falls down. It's the hardest part. Because reporters need to report facts, right? And science rarely gives that kind of certainty. So how do you talk about uncertainty in science and still give a reporter something they can report? And you are free to argue with this, but this is how I've seen it work the most. Confirm certainty where you know it, and acknowledge uncertainty where it exists. And I have examples of all of these. For example, if you work on animals and a reporter wants to know what this means for humans, you can say, we've certainly seen enough evidence in the lab to know we should take preventive action or be concerned or do more research, whatever it is you want to say. But we don't know for absolute certain at what level this causes health harm in humans. We wouldn't test this on humans because we suspect it's going to be harmful. The phrase, we know enough to know, works really well with reporters. Nothing works all the time, but basically if you give a reporter that, they've got something. And I have a really good example coming up. Flip the burden of proof. Oh, I took that out, sorry. The reporter says, so you're not sure this causes birth defects, or this causes cancer or fibroids? You say, I am certain the safety of this has not yet been proved, and I am certain there's evidence to be concerned. If you whatever you feel to be true. Do some research, know the other points of view reporters are going to hear before you start interviewing, and you can inoculate them to those, as we said before, and I have a good example coming up. It's a great idea to tell reporters the other points of view they're going to hear and provide them your responses. And if your work is going to be considered controversial, and much environmental health research is, give the reporter, have ready a list of 3 or 4 recent studies that support your findings. Have a couple of experts, 1, 2 at the most, people who have agreed to read your study and be available to talk to a reporter or two if they want an opinion from someone or comment from someone who's not an author on your paper. It helps a lot. Most reporters want to find their own third-party validators, but for those who don't have time and you're ready to go, it's really good. So this is a great example of talking about uncertainty in science. She confirms uncertainty and goes on to talk about what she is sure of. We've seen enough to know, we know enough to know. The reporter couldn't resist this. She's not going out on a limb, she's not going out of her comfort zone, it's exactly what she does know and what she doesn't know, but it's enough to make a news story. So, these headlines are about the same study in the same paper, contradictory headlines 2 days in a row, one day to the next. I would wager that day 1 the journalist talked to the researcher, and perhaps later that day someone critical of the study provided another point of view, probably calling the editor and screening, which changed the headline for day 2. Had the researcher said, you might hear this, and when you hear this, think you can respond. You can prepare the reporter for that, and we wouldn't have had day 2. So that's why you want to tell them what they're going to hear and give them your responses first. It'll really keep them from getting pulled off track, and they appreciate it tremendously.
The first one got a lot more hits than the other one.
Yeah. Yes. And that's a good thing, because it was a good study. But remember, sometimes editors write the headlines anyway, and you can't, the reporter might do a great job with the story. Nothing you can do. I just have to say, this is, it's really important distinction. And sometimes reporters don't get it. It's up to the scientists to make sure reporters get this right. Be very clear about whether you found an association or cause. Say A causes B, and environmental health, we run this all the time. The reporters find that so much easier to write about. Yeah, you've been there, haven't you? You can't let them go away believing cause if that's not what you found. You have to tell them what to report, and you may have to tell them several times. You can say there's a strong association, be prepared to explain what that means. I find if I hear my myself using the word cause, it's a red flag. I stop and make sure that's what I really mean. You can also ask the reporter to repeat back to you the main point. You know, can you tell me how that came across? If you hear them saying cause, you can stop them and fix it. But you need to make that case really strongly with the reporter. So, for example, these headlines are compelling. They sold papers, they got eyes on crime. But the problem is this research was done in mice, not humans. So headlines picked up everywhere, you know, they went all over social media. But they're misleading, implying the study was on kids and that the findings were causal. Which, you know, what that does ultimately is it destroys the credibility of the scientist. I mean, it can. It destroys a strong word. It chips away at it.
Well,
Yeah.
there's another part here too. You know, these kinds of headlines, I mean, as a pediatrician, these kind of headlines drive parents nuts. They don't, you know, they get much more anxious and much more worried and do things that they don't really need to do, which costs them time and money and may actually, in the long run, harm their kids. So, you know, I think we do need to be very careful with what we convey, because it's not just the reporters. If we are truly trying to communicate with the general public, then we need to keep in mind how the general public may react to these statements.
Absolutely. And I'm picturing how your phone will be ringing off the hook from parents who, yeah. I think I might have called you once when my kids were little. Yeah. So, I'm looking at the time. We're going to go pretty quickly through the rest of this. On camera, television is a different training, and I'm happy to do it if anyone wants, but for here we're just going to go quickly. Most interviews now are by phone or computer or email. So for sound, it's really hard to just start talking. Your voice sounds, everybody's voice sounds kind of not quite ready. So what you want to do is warm up before you pick up the phone. On radio, they might tell you you're going to talk to the producer first and answer a few questions. Always be prepared because you may pick up the phone and be on air. So warm up your voice first, even if they tell you you're going to have time beforehand. During the interview, vary your tone and inflection. Emphasize words. People can't see you. They don't see your hands waving. They don't see your face. Overemphasize if you have to. Then try not to speak too quickly. This one's really hard for me. Saying less clearly is better than saying everything in a rush. Just keep that in mind if you're a fast talker. It's where those clear, concise main messages are so important. Speak genuinely, credibly, confidently. You're the expert on your science. A lot of people up top, and what happens is it sounds like you're asking questions, but people do it when they're nervous, and it's really annoying. So try not to do it. Listen to yourself talk. Everyone has a placeholder. Become aware of what yours is. Practice not using it. In a radio interview, it can be really annoying to hear somebody, at the end of the day, 6 times in like 2 minutes, you know, whatever your placeholder is. Talking slower helps sometimes, but being prepared helps the most to get rid of that. Assume you're always on the air. Until you've hung up your phone or until the camera is not only off, but you're away from the camera, like you're out of the studio, anything you say, just because you think it's over, don't count on it. Don't shoot up your nose, please. You've all seen people do this, right? All you have to do is angle the camera so you're looking directly at your camera or just a few inches down. You know, just put books under it, whatever it is you want to do, but check it first. You want the light in front of you, not behind you. If it's behind you, the camera is going to pick up the light and it'll darken you. So move your camera or close your blinds, whatever you have to do. Background, these are my favorites. See what other people are going to see and give yourself time to adjust it before you start the call. I used to have a clock that was a beautiful piece of art from Italy, but it didn't tell time anymore. And apparently it was very distracting for people who had something to do. It took like a month before you were told. So, you know, if there's something very personal or distracting, your office is messy, see what people are going to see and you have to fix it. Distractions, even really attractive ones, are not good. Do you remember that interview, I think it was a BBC interview of the man whose kid came running out? Okay, everyone remembers that. Does anyone remember what he
said?
I was watching it. Who is this?
He was trying to be so serious too, he kept going.
You can have a lot of control in an interview. I love that quote. It really works. Journalists use different techniques to help them get a story, and sometimes it is just their personal style, and sometimes it's a trick to get you to say more than you want. But once you know what they are, well, these are three of the most common. A reporter wants to get you to agree to a misinterpretation or an exaggeration of their findings. Maybe they're rushed, they think they already know what they're going to write, and they just want you to validate it. No, you have to be sure to correct it. You have to restate the message in your own words as often as you have to. Nope, it's not that, it's this. Oh no, that's not quite right, it's this. Keep going until you're sure they've got it right. Don't let them leave with the wrong idea. Don't feel awkward, silent pauses. That is human nature. To just you finish what you have to say, and they wait. And they might just be taking notes, because reporters do still write in longhand, a lot of them. Or it might be a trick to get you to fill the void and just keep talking. It's not a good idea. So when you're done, be aware you're done. And you can say, are we finished? No, I'm just writing, whatever they're going to tell you. Don't hypothesize or speculate. Reporters might ask you to do that, but it's really easy to be taken out of context. Just tell the reporter, I don't want to speculate, but what I did find, and go back to your main messages. And that's where you're going. You're not going to let the reporter lead you off. And as I said, this is an abbreviated legal training. There's more. These are just the top 10 favorites. This is fun. These are those questions you hope nobody asks you, but if you're prepared before you start interviewing, it's really not difficult. For policy questions, it's different for everyone. Where do you want to go? Decide before you start interviewing what you want to say publicly about policy. For most scientists, I don't want to talk about policy because I'm not a policy expert. And the answer is simply, if you're asked, should this be banned, doesn't the government test for safety? So, I'm not a policy expert, so I can't tell policymakers what to do, but I hope my science informs them, gives them, helps them make good policy to protect public health. That is the safest answer, and reporters will accept it. Personal questions. In environmental health, we get those all the time. Would you, if you were pregnant, would you live in a neighborhood, live next to a bus depot? Do studies on air pollution? Again, it's up to everybody to decide what they want, but the things to watch out for are, you talk about, everyone should eat organic food. People should move away from bus depot. People can't afford that. And you don't want to come off saying that. It's not really helpful. Good answers are, it's really not about what any one person would do or what I would do. This is a public health issue. Or just bypass it completely and say, for people who want to reduce their exposures, and you have a fact sheet from your university or from one of the government agencies ready and you offer to the reporter. So those are really comfortable things to do. Some people prefer to go way personal, and that's fine. But know before you start talking, you look like a deer in the headlights. And know that reporters are going to go look for someone critical of your study. If they can't find someone, great, but they will go look for it. So look around on websites like American Council on Science and Health, junkscience.com, Science Media Center, and you'll find what they might find. And you can be prepared to respond. What I was going to do is go through...
Amy, just a point to emphasize here. You mentioned 3 places that sound like they're totally reliable. And, anybody in this room could go to them not understanding, in fact, what they really are doing.
I just assumed you all know those. I'm sorry. Junkscience.com is a website run by a man named Steve Malloy who pretty much refutes science in favor of messages from people who pay him. American Council on Science and Health, they're supported heavily by chemical industry, soft drink industry, I think everything but tobacco and seatbelts are their bailiwick. Science Media Center is actually really good on some aspects of science. They're really good on chemistry and math, I've heard. But they don't believe in some aspects of environmental science. Take a look at those and see. I'm not saying they're all evil, but they are funded in large part. If you look, a lot of people have done a lot of research to figure this out. And they tend to disparage environmental health science. So you can usually see on there what kind of criticisms reporters will be hearing, what will be in their ears. Recently, FDA, are people familiar with the Clarity BPA studies? Okay. I'm looking at the clock and I'm thinking in terms of time, I'm going to skip the last bit of this and maybe not go deep into Clarity, but just tell you that I got calls from reporters, several, saying, so industry's been telling me that FDA is about to say low-dose exposure to bisphenol A is safe based on the Clarity papers. What do you think? Should I write about that? And what ended up happening was a bunch of scientists, who some of whom were researchers in that program, decided we better do a webinar and explain what we're finding. And so they didn't, so having awareness of what reporters were being fed by people with a private interest in, or financial interest in the findings, helped scientists to say, wait, here's true north, here's what we found, here's what we're seeing. And as a result, there was one study, one reporter kind of drank the Kool-Aid, and it happened to be on NPR, but yeah.
So, what you're telling us is that it's important for us as scientists to know how to make a presentation. But there's another side. Obviously, that's hugely important. Most scientists don't know how to interact with reporters. But the other side of that coin is the reporters. And the question is, are there programs in this country to train reporters in science? Because so much of what we do as scientists, and when we talk to reporters, they have no idea what we're talking about. So the question is, can you train them on the other side?
If I could get funding, I would do that. But Rick Weiss, who used to write for Washington Post as a science writer, he runs Sciline now, and he's starting to do that. It's run by AAAS, and I would trust him to do it, and we're going to possibly collaborate on some of that.
Aren't there some fellowships?
There are.
But they're, it's 2 reporters a year kind of thing.
Yeah, I don't think it's a big enough movement that you can count on it. Reporters learn how to report, and that's,
So, like in the last year, it feels like the anti-science sentiment is increasing in this country. So do you think that has implications for scientists engaging in science communication and talking to them?
we've spent a lot of time thinking about that and looking at it. What I'm seeing, the worst case hasn't come true yet, and I really focus only on environmental health science and fracking. What we've seen is that scientists talking to journalists, that really hasn't changed. Your job is still give them the main point and tell them why it matters. For journalists, it's really changed. They have to tell stories. They have to make connections with it. They're the ones where trust is lost. Scientists are still very well respected. There's a handful in our government who don't believe science, but most people do. Public opinion research still sits squarely with science. And I'll let you know, you have to disagree if it changes. But there is a little fun little fact. Associated Press did a survey, and they found that 53% of Americans are confident vaccines are safe and effective, and it's about the same proportion of Americans who believe houses can be haunted. So
Say that again, what's the number?
53%.
53% believe.
That vaccines are safe, and 53% believe houses can be haunted.
Wow.
The point is, you're never going to convince everyone. Your job, though, as a scientist, you've got to carve out your piece, is to get that to the reporter in a way the reporter can use it. Now you understand how reporters are going to be thinking about approaching your science, so it might make it a little less daunting, a little clearer. The reporters have the heavy lift of getting it to their audiences, but they know their audiences. And it's a completely different training if you're going to be talking to community groups, where you are going to want to find common ground, and you are going to want to tell stories. You're not going to want to use data slides and we've done some work with that as well, and it's fun, but it's a different thing, so.
Also, so some of our students are leaving, but, okay, so a lot of what you've talked about, I mean, I've done a lot of this, and I've done this kind of training, and it's great, but it's a lot of work, right? And so can you talk to the people about, in the room, about what are some of the benefits of putting the effort into this kind of stuff? Because it takes a lot of time, right?
It does, it takes a lot of time in preparation, it takes a lot of time in actually doing the interviews, especially if you're getting attention. It takes a lot of time in follow-up, making sure things are done accurately and responding to the reporter if it's written poorly or if they got a fact wrong. The benefits are that people learn of your work and they learn about it accurately in the context and start to move the dialogue, public understanding. I also think a lot of environmental health research is the underpinning for consumer advocacy campaigns. We want those campaigns based on real science. If the science isn't out there, they are going to use whatever they got. Policymakers, newspapers, they're not necessarily going to read journals. They're not going to be reading, although a few do, but most don't. And they're not reading science papers. They're reading mainstream news. More and more we're seeing people get all their news from social media. We work a lot with social media influencers. But the way that works most often is an article will come out in Time Magazine or the New York Times or Washington Post or somewhere, and somebody will post it on Facebook and it gets reposted and it gets tweeted about, but you want to have that, there's still room for mainstream media.
I just heard that term recently, social media influencers. They're actual jobs. What, can you explain those?
We work with a group called Momavation. It's wonderful. She's got hundreds of bloggers, and they are the social media influencers. And she is Leia Segedi, who runs this, has a whole social media conference every year called ShiftCon. It's a lot of, and her audience, the people she brings in, are a lot of mommy bloggers, a lot of green bloggers. So they're not necessarily credentialed journalists. They're not people who you might trust, respect, and embargo, but they are an incredibly important audience for research, for this kind of research, to be communicated in really plain language. So once we have a great article on a study, we send it to all of them. And they usually write very emotional, personal pieces for their audiences. And that's the storytelling part. So
Now that's the positive side of environmental health, but then there's the, you could do this in reverse too. There's a lot of outlets that would just bash the science and create doubt in some of these articles. Seems like I've seen a lot more of that.
Really? What are you reading?
Climate change stuff.
Yeah, okay, so climate is really different. It's a different ballgame. Environmental health science, the natural audience is parents, anyone who wants to be a parent, people who have grandchildren. And they are not a terribly skeptical audience if they feel they're not being smart. And so if they're getting the news from someone they think is credible, a reporter they trust or a social media writer they trust, they are going to accept it. One thing I worry about is having advocacy groups building campaigns on science that's not real. It sounds like science, or it makes sense, it's intuitive. So one of our goals is to make sure the real science gets out there so loudly that it can be used for that. And policymakers who really, are so overwhelmed, they don't have time to read. My very first job out of grad school was the Department of Public Health in Massachusetts, and they said, take this study and show us how you would bring it to the State House. And I thought I never made it this job, but I was the YMCA youth director at the time. I took a piece of paper and markers, colored markers, and I left a lot of white space and a lot of color. And I brought it in and I got the job. Legislators don't have time to read anything, so you gotta just make it pop out, and I'm not sure, climate is just different, and I'm sorry. I don't spend a lot of time studying that, and I think I'm sad.
Well, Amy, the bloggers,
Oh,
and
yeah.
that's similar
Yes.
to climate too, that you're, if you vet the reporter, and you can do that even if you're not an expert on this by going online, looking at the stories you've done in the past.
Yes.
Usually you can tell, and you can tell if they're from a reputable place, the New York Times, the Guardian,
NPR's blog is really good.
Yeah.
But I thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah.
There are some reporters I would say just don't bother, don't return their call, don't send them your paper. Steve Malloy is one. He's not actually a credentialed journalist anymore. He says he is. He writes junkscience.com, and he asks for the papers a lot.
So I think it's past our time, so I want to formally end the seminar and thank Amy